which was... So, grants from the federal government to study CER, in particular behavioral economics, in the context. And the suggestions that they made in their write-up for the grant included to compare different behavioral economic approaches and find out which are most effective. Whether initially observed enhancements of CER uptake could be maintained. And whether uptake is different in different geographic regions or other subsets of the population. Now, what I found interesting was the description that included behavioral economics refers to an interdisciplinary effort, which includes social psychologists and citizen scientists, and then tries to take into account what is known about how people actually make decisions rather than relying on another. Wow. It's just not my voice? Rather than relying on the assumption that economic agents are rational in the sense of expected utility theory. Now, that's a common theme for behavioral economics, that economic agents are not rational. They're irrational. I think it's a little broader than that, the context in which most behavioral economists, not most, but some behavioral economists will talk about rationality. Now, do they mean rationality as we might? Do we mean rationality in the sense of sort of, people that drive faster than you, or hormone-soaked teenagers, or, people that go to the University of Texas, or things like that? No, they're pretty specific. They're talking about it just in the context of this one theory in economics, expected utility theory. And I think we need to spend a little bit of time, well, not too much time, but a little bit of time talking about what they mean by this type of irrationality. Now, expected utility theory, I'm not going to go into it in any great detail, but all it really says is that you can weight the outcomes by the likelihood that they're going to occur, and those payoffs, those average payoffs, weighted average payoffs, are the way you evaluate the mixed strategy or the combination of outcomes. So it works just like any other probability theory. Now, what Kahneman and Tversky did, who are referenced in the grant, what Kahneman and Tversky did was study something about the irrelevance and whether or not irrelevant alternatives are important. So let me put it this way. If something is irrelevant, it shouldn't cause you to vary your decision. Now, think about the study that they did to illustrate this was called the Asian disease. Imagine that a disease is coming to the U.S. and it's going to kill 600 people. And you have two alternatives to deal with this problem. And the effect of these two alternatives is known with certainty. You can choose one or the other. The first choice is choice A, and if you choose A, then 200 people will be saved. If you choose option B, then there's a 1/3 chance that all 600 will be saved and a 2/3 chance that none will be saved. Now, the expected value of choice B is 200, just like choice A. Most people, I don't know what you would choose, I'll give you a second to think about that. Most people choose A. They like the certainty. The funny thing is, if you ask, the second half of your population, you split a group in two, and you ask them the question this way, choice A prime is that 400 people will die for certain. Choice B prime is that you have a 1/3 chance of saving, 1/3 chance of everybody dying, and a 2/3 chance of no one dying. Sorry, 1/3 chance that, I knew I had that wrong. 1/3 chance that 0 will die, and a 2/3 chance that 600 will die. Now, that's the same exact choices that you had before. The only difference is now it's in terms of people dying instead of people being saved. I've just changed the words. All the math is the same. Now people will choose the riskier option. They'll choose to play option B instead. There's no reason they should. Expected utility theory wouldn't let you pick between the two differently, but people do. You can do the same thing with wealth effects. If I said to you, you have two choices. You can do nothing, stay just as you are, and your wealth remains just as it is. Or I'll let you play a gamble. So there's a 50% chance if you play the gamble that you'll lose $100. There's also a 50% chance that you'll win $150. When presented with that option, and you take a second to see what you would do, most people choose not to take the gamble. But if I subtract $100 from every one of those values and restate the question and say to you, okay, you can do nothing, and if you do nothing, you lose 100. Or you can take the gamble where there's a 50% chance that you lose 200 or a 50% chance that you'll make 50. People all pick the gamble. They shouldn't. There's nothing in expected utility theory that will let you do it. But they will. And this has been repeated. So this is the reason Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in 2002 and the sort of roots of his own theory and prospect theory and what have you. But I think what's interesting, if you think about the context of this grant, when I first read about the grant, I was learning for the first time about the All-Hat study. And it doesn't have to be the All-Hat study, but imagine a policymaker, a decision maker, and think about what Greg was talking about yesterday about what's centric. Are we cost-centric? I mean, the people who wrote this grant, are they thinking about cost or are they thinking about patients? I'm not sure I know, but I think there's a question there. If I'm a policymaker and I've made a study and I've put it out and it says, you know, a drug A is just as good or better than drug B, and it's more cost effective, and yet nobody does it. And I might start to wonder why. Some people will suggest maybe that the study wasn't very good. But as the policymaker, I may think, well, you know, people always criticize. There's always flaws in every study. And then the idea comes to me that people are irrational. That sounds pretty good. And that it depends on how you ask the question. If you ask the question differently, I could get a different answer. That sounds pretty good too. So maybe that has something to do with the way people behave. I think irrationality, as I say, might be broader than that. I mean, we all know that there are issues, psychological issues, with the way people think and the way they approach problems. Optical illusions, for example, work. If I draw two lines that are of equal length the right way, with little arrows on the ends, you'll think they're of different lengths. It's just the way it is. It's just the way it works. If I ask you that to take it for given that a bat and a ball cost $1.10, and then tell you that the bat costs $1 more than the ball, and ask you how much the ball costs, many people will say 10 cents, which isn't the right answer, but they will. And it has to do with the way, essentially, that information is accessed. The psychologists would tell us that, you know, if we present things in a certain way, certain parts of the information are easier to get at than other parts. Kahneman himself will tell you that if you take the same age and disease problem and show both presentations of the question to people, they don't think they ought to have different answers for the two. They don't think in one case they ought to pick the certainty, on the other the gamble. So it's the way it's presented that actually has the influence. And markets are terrific at solving this. And in fact, as an innovation firm, and I'll sort of leave it with this for questions, but as an innovation firm, we should also think about the fact that people can change what they're doing. If you think about the problems you can have in markets with, say, asymmetric information, you have signaling to solve the problem. You have screening to solve the problem. More broadly, you know, if you go back to the optical illusions, there's nothing to stop us from inventing a ruler and putting it on the page and using it. So we can, even for the optical illusion, solve the problems that we have. So anyway, I'll leave you with those thoughts and turn it over to Adam. This is the microphone. This
Okay. I have some technical challenges here because I need to get onto this perilous podium. Open up some slides. God, look at it all. Sometimes when I'm sitting at these kind of podiums looking at this stuff, I'm reminded of watching television in the 1970s. And do you remember how long it took for a TV to warm up? This is terrible technology. Why do we still wait for these things? Anyway, so since I'm up here, I might as well stay. So great to have a chance to talk to you this morning. The title of the talk is R&D for free. I must confess that's a rather fanciful idea. It's not really about R&D for free. It's really about the affordability of R&D in pharmaceuticals. It's something we talked a lot about yesterday. A number of points have already been mentioned about the challenges we face in continuing our endeavours to make the medicines of the future. And there are many things which we need to address in order to continue that kind of endeavour. But cost is definitely one of them. So I just wanted to go through some things about that and see if there are some bits where we can really make a difference in the cost base of what we do in research. So let's start with a picture. This picture has nothing to do with medical R&D, but it did in my mind when I was designing the talk. So this is a picture of something in the UK. It's called the Ribblehead Viaduct. And it's part of a spectacular bit of Victorian engineering, which was a brand new railway line. It was built in, well, it was brand new when it was built. It's not brand new anymore. It was built in the late 1870s, and it connects a very, very small town in the north of England, Settle, with a rather horrible northern town on the Scottish border called Carlisle. And this viaduct is one part of it. So the reason why I was thinking about this is just that there are some bits when you look around and you see these kind of amazing things that people did, and you go, wow, how do they do that? Why did they do that? So this was built at a time when things were quite tough in Britain. There was a lot of innovation and engineering, lots of ambition about what could be done. And in the UK, there are lots of these bits of infrastructure which we still rely on, and they still amaze us. So if you grew up in the US, I guess I would hope that you had slightly more recent examples than the 1870s. In the UK, we have to try and go back a bit. But one thing there is just to say... So we're in a perilous position with R&D. I'm in a fairly perilous position up here. But the people who got involved in this work faced a lot of challenges. So particularly in this case, this is one of the reasons I was thinking about this example, is that when the shareholders and the company who built this railway got permission to build the railway line, all set to go, got an Act of Parliament through, really excited about building this new thing. And then there was an enormous banking crisis. Very many people in Britain went bankrupt. A number of railway companies went bankrupt. And the shareholders tried to stop this project. They tried to pull out of building the railway, but they were obligated to do it. So they did go through with it, and they constructed this line, and it's still here for us to use today. So what I was thinking in my mind is not just about the parallels with banking crises and the problems of shareholder investment in new endeavours, just that it's worth bearing in mind that it's always challenging to do something amazing. It was challenging for these people who did this work, and it'll be challenging for us in medicines. So the question I really wanted to pose is, if we want to be doing equivalent work like this in medicines for the next 20 years and more, what do we have to do about the cost? So here's a slightly more familiar slide. And this just looks at some of the issues in cost in drug discovery and development. So there are a number of different buckets of cost. So on the left-hand side, the 100 million figure is the cost of bringing one program to market, just from the clinical trials, the preclinical work, and the laboratory work. You add all that up for a successful medicine, it costs at least $100 million. And then, as we talked about a lot yesterday, we have to bear in mind that most projects don't work. So you have to invest in a whole range of projects, most of which fail, in order to get your one at the end. And this is average industry statistics over quite a long period of time. So an average figure there about the portfolio cost of bringing one medicine to market is around $1 billion. I think if we did that number over the last couple of years across the industry, it would be quite a lot bigger than that. It might be 2 or 3 times that. But over an average, it's about $1 billion of investment in R&D to get a new drug. And then the final thing is about the cost of capital. It's a kind of portfolio cost of raising that billion and spending it over the time in which you're investing in new medicines. So I just want to go through those 3 buckets and see what we can do about those different things. Oops. So in terms of the cost of one program to market, 2 things going on there. One is that the shift in those costs is shifting from being about 50-50 between research and clinical development to being about 40% in research and 60% in development. So the development costs are escalating, and we have some colleagues from regulatory here who might know why that is. We're being asked for more and more data. So there are lots of programs and initiatives to try and work on that. On the research side, I think there are some very, very interesting approaches about how we might reduce some of those costs. And the key thing seems to me to be about the creation and expansion of pre-competitive consortia and collaboration between large pharmaceutical companies. So there are a couple of examples either side of the Atlantic. The CPI, Critical Path Initiative, is one you may be familiar with. Over here in the EU, we have the Innovative Medicines Initiative, which is also co-funded by the European Commission. So the idea there is that companies who used to compete on almost everything are realizing that quite a lot of areas in fundamental research are shared interests. So if we share and identify common research issues and pool our resources, you can get much more effective and efficient programs to reduce some of these costs. So the transformational bit there is not to create them because they're being created, and not to participate in them because we are participating. But I think what we haven't done in research is build those as a fundamental part of the way that we organize our research. They're kind of additional things to what's being done. So, for example, we mentioned yesterday, I think, the Alzheimer's biomarker program, which is very successful and very good, but that's something we're doing as well as our in-house program. It's not part of our in-house research. So I think if we committed more to some of these pre-competitive consortia and identified more and more areas where that was an effective approach, I think that would be very good. On the second bit, which is the portfolio cost and the attrition program cost, again, reducing attrition is a kind of holy grail of drug R&D. People have been working on it for ages. Lots of things about that, particularly to do with the fundamental complexity of human biology and how difficult it will be to actually really make a difference to that attrition. But one very live policy topic is whether or not we can, as a company or as a sector, reduce our risk to this inevitable attrition. And we might be able to do that. The idea is that we can do that by sort of outsourcing some of the research. And rather than doing all the research ourselves, we let other people in universities and biotechnology companies do the work, and they sort of polish these lovely projects, and then we just pick and buy the ones in and turn them into medicines. And that would, of course, reduce our exposure to this particular risk. So that's a great idea, and people are advocating it more and more. It's something we've always done as an industry, but there are some people out there adopting and advocating a fairly extreme perspective on this. There's a Morgan Stanley report called Exit Research and Create Value. I think the title of that tells you all about what some people out there are saying, is that it's not really worth our doing any in-house research, just buy it in. And, it's one option, but if we look here at what some of the success rates of these things are, so the red line at the top is the in-house programs, and this is the success rate at phase 3. So this is a graph from the Financial Times last week. It's got very misleading axes, terrible, shoddy journalism, but it makes the point fairly clearly. So the red line at the top is the success rate of our in-house programs, which are, on averaging, I think, about 73% across the industry. And the blue line is the licensed or acquired programs, and there you can see the average is below 60, more like 55%. So there are lots of complexities in this, lots of things going on that underpin these numbers, but suffice to say, I would just think that outsourcing your R&D and trying to offload the cost to other people isn't the way actually we can reduce that risk inevitably. Then we might be able to help, we might be able to do something there, but it's not a sort of magic bullet that will solve the attrition problem. So the final area I wanted to cover was about the portfolio cost. And again, not really cost of capital. I don't really understand that. That's not really my area. But the idea, the areas where there is some policy innovation going on is around using other people's money to develop medicines. and particularly other people who have a different view of cost of capital. So if you take work with charities, so a good example might be the Gates Foundation or the Wellcome Trust in the UK, who are very keen to do work where pharmaceutical companies are not really going to engage in a very committed, long-term way, like in the neglected tropical diseases. It's very difficult for us to make money as a private company in those things. So there's a great role for charities there. So again, a bit like the pre-competitive consortia, like the IMI and the CPI, there are charities out there who are willing to fund the creation of partnerships and collaborations. The end result of these things is often that there will be zero commercial return for us. So that's a problem for a private company. But what we're asked to contribute across different companies is expertise, in-kind resource. So it might be full-time equivalent staff, it might be some IP, but we need to commit something to these programs that charities are trying to collate in order for them to succeed. And again, we're having to commit resources at a time when budgets are under scrutiny and commit them for quite a long time for the projects to work, and we know that there will be no commercial return. So this is a problem. It's a great way of reducing the cost of the program in the abstract. If you're a patient, you might think this is a great way of reducing some cost or deploying some different kinds of capital to make a medicine. But the way that we participate in those things is still a bit of a challenge for us. I don't think we've sorted out how to do that. Another area, final area around portfolio cost, or the cost of capital stuff, is around another set of innovations between partnerships between big pharmaceutical companies. So you may be aware of the work that Pfizer has done with GSK in setting up ViiV, which is a pooled company, a sort of joint venture in HIV. It took our HIV small commercial portfolio and large research portfolio, and GSK's large commercial portfolio and small research portfolio, put them together, and they've made a standalone company. Now, the interesting thing about that, I think, is that if we hadn't created that joint venture, we would have looked at our work in HIV and gone, well, you know, this isn't really working out. It's not very easy to make money here. We've got other things we need to work on. So let's deprioritize this, and deprioritize it to the point where we might have closed it down. And GSK similarly said, look, our molecules are getting old. They're going to go off patent. We haven't got much of a pipeline. This isn't a great area. Let's close it down. So as separate entities, we would have shut down 2 lots of HIV research. By looking at areas where you can collaborate and create something very innovative like this joint venture, I think what's happened, I don't know how long this ViiV project will succeed for. I've no idea. We never really know. But at least what it's done is create a sort of commitment and a way in which this research can continue. So I think that's another interesting model, again, about collaborations between big companies and what we can do to address these large and escalating costs. So that's really pretty much all I wanted to say. So but in summary, it seems to me that there are 3 things we need to do if we want to be the company which is making these amazing medicines in the next 10 or 20 years' time. And the first one is something we spend a lot of time doing, which is we need to stay really, really rich, because this is not going to get cheaper. This is not going to be an amateur's game. We need to be really, really seriously wealthy to engage in this work. Another area where I think we spend a lot less time, but is equally important, is that we need to be optimistic, because we're always going to have to put our resources at risk to do this work. And you need optimism to be committed to doing that. And a small element of that is we also need to be optimistic about our own in-house research. I don't think we can outsource the optimism and expect other people to be optimistic and investing if we aren't doing that ourselves. And then the final thing is really just to think about collaborations between big companies. I know, my background in science policy, in government and elsewhere, has always been focused on small companies, university spin-outs, that kind of way of generating new innovation. I think as these costs escalate and continue to be extremely high, I think it's the collaborations between big companies and making sure that a company like Pfizer is skilled and expert and committed to collaborating in a very serious way is one of the ways that we'll be able to address some of these big challenges. So that's all I want to say.
Your turn, sir. Thanks, Adam. Do you, Uda? God, I wanted to say that. This is a central question that I want you to think about in this discussion this morning. In part, what I want to do is tell you a story about a little-known Air Force colonel by the name of John Boyd. He's someone who probably did more to change the way the military operates in this country than any other individual in the last 100 years. Pretty remarkable person. So my objective today is to, one, tell you a little bit about Boyd, tell you a little bit about the OODA loop that he's known for, tell you why the Marines actually revered this Air Force pilot, and then relate this to public policy. So we'll see if I can make that through today. So let's start at the end. You know, I've read a number of books about John Boyd. And the first book I read started with a story about his funeral. And what was remarkable was there was a large contingency from the Marines that attended his funeral, full dress uniform. And at the end of the ceremony, the senior-most Marine knelt down before his grave, removed his Marine emblem from his collar, and placed it on the grave, which is essentially saying, "You're one of us." Now, how many people saw A Few Good Men? Right? What was the relationship between the Marines and the Air Force? Not great, right? That's probably typified in the relationship that existed at this time for Boyd. But what is interesting, and the reason the Marines revered him, was his approach to strategy, ultimately resulting in the change in military doctrine for the Marines because of the way he taught people to think about engaging. And I think there's something there for us to learn. In fact, at Marine headquarters in Quantico, they actually have a statue of John Boyd, and that's where they keep all of his papers. Rather remarkable individual. I read this and I thought, I've got to know more. So, back in the late 1940s, Boyd joined the Army Air Corps. Brief stint, he got an ROTC scholarship, went to college, studied economics, studied engineering, basically earned a commission into the newly formed United States Air Force, and ended up going toward the end of the career, serving in the Air Force. He finally earned his wings, but really never had a chance to engage in battle. But during the time that he was there, he became a very, very accomplished pilot. And ultimately, when he came back stateside, went to Nellis Air Force Base. Anybody see Top Gun? Nellis Air Force Base is essentially the Top Gun for the Air Force. And you may recall when Tom Cruise did this little button hook turn that got him in all kinds of trouble. Well, that was Boyd who came up with that move. And he was the master of maneuverability, of being able to be quick and turn. In fact, it earned him the nickname 42nd Boyd, saying that he could reverse the position of those two planes, starting in the disadvantaged position in front, and in less than 40 seconds, get on the tail of his opponent. And that was because of his ability to analyze a situation quickly. Now, at this point, he hadn't thought through all of the different elements about how all of this worked. But when he was done serving his stint at Nellis, he went back to school, Georgia Tech, and decided to study industrial engineering. And at that time, he was taking a course on thermodynamics, of all things, and thought, I could relate thermodynamics to what I was doing flying a plane. And he came up with what he called his energy maneuverability theory. And this became used worldwide to be able to evaluate specs on airplanes to determine which one was technically superior. And he applied some of this to some of the planes that he had flown in Korea. This is the F-86. Now, his analysis, his algorithm, ultimately created a quandary for Boyd, because when he did a comparison of the F-86 against a MiG-15, which was the chief opposing airplane during Korea, the MiG-15, according to his specs, should have won every time. However, in Korea, we had a 10-to-1 kill ratio over the MiG-15. So why was that? And this is where Boyd starts to evolve into a new level of thinking that I want you all to think about. But if you look at the difference between these two planes, there's a critical element that maybe is not all that easy to see in the picture, but the F-86 had a canopy that was pretty much clear all the way around, which gave our pilots a much greater level of situational awareness, knowing everything that was around them. At the same time, our planes had hydraulic controls. The MiGs did not. And by the way, if you look at the canopy of the MiG, there's a lot more obstructions in their canopy. So the ability to have hydraulic controls allowed our pilots to maneuver much quicker, constantly confusing the opponent, giving us the edge 10 times more than the MiGs, right? So Boyd did a lot of thinking about this, applied this to other airplanes. To make a long story short, Boyd is actually credited for the F-15 and the F-16, which are the mainstay in the military right now among fighter pilots. So this is at least one of the things that he's known for. But something that he's probably most known for people that study Boyd, is something called the OODA loop. It's observe, orient, decide, and act. And this was a continuously evolving loop that at the very early phases of assessing a situation, you need to have the best observations possible. You need to have good situational awareness, just like we all need to when we're doing public policy. The more information, the better information, the better the decisions that we can make. Now, I'll come back to orient for a minute, because I would tell you that it's the orientation process that is the key, and it certainly, Boyd would tell you this is the keystone to the OODA loop. I would say that this is at the heart of what most of us do every day in our work. And then, based on this orientation, we would make a decision and act. And you'll notice in this loop, and by the way, for anybody who's come into my office, you'll see that I've had this hanging on my wall for at least the last 6 to 8 years now. So it's something that I'm always thinking about. And by the way, for researchers, you'll notice Boyd actually did a lot of thinking. How do you apply this to science, right? And you'll notice, as opposed to the decide and act, he said, well, you generate a hypothesis and you test the hypothesis. So it applies in a lot of different ways. It's been used a lot in business, and I think we can use it for policy as well. But like I said, the keystone here is the orientation. And this is where I think the real value in our group comes out, because each of us runs a filter over the observations that we make on a daily basis. Each of us bring our own genetic heritage. We bring our cultural traditions, and we're getting in new information constantly, yet we're also bringing in our previous experiences. And the key to making our analyses work is working that filter, analyzing the situation, and synthesizing something new and different, something unexpected. This is what Boyd would refer to as the chi, the unorthodox, the unexpected, as opposed to the chang, which is what people would expect us to do. All right? But in order to make this work, yes, you want to come up with something unexpected, but at the same time, you want to know what is what Boyd would call your Schwerpunkt. It's your mission critical. Or to put it in terms that I recently heard from Haley Barber, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Okay? You need to know what that mission critical is. And then, as a result of that, the quicker that you can move through your loop, the And if you can do that quicker and better than somebody who you're differing with in a position, the more likely you are to win. Now, something that Boyd used to do, and by the way, Boyd was famous for his 15-hour dissertations that would take 2 days, and he refused to give shortened versions of this. So we're doing in 15 minutes what Boyd would do in 15 hours. But he would try to get people to think differently, to help people generate those new and different ideas. So he would start by presenting 4 different scenarios that everybody could relate to. Somebody skiing, a motorboat, a bicycle, and a toy truck. And he would go through the process of getting people to break down those scenes into their elemental parts. And then came the magic of trying to get people to synthesize and come up with something different. And ultimately, as part of the exercise, he would come up with the snowmobile, where you would take the skis from the ski scene in front of the snowmobile, the engine from the motorboat to power the snowmobile, the handlebars, and of course the track. And so Boyd then, as part of this exercise, would try to get people, we often hear thinking out of the box. I mean, this is Mr. Out of the Box all the time. And he would think about those new creative ideas as snowmobiles. So I was kind of thinking about, what are some of the snowmobiles that we as a company, we in policy have been a part of that really have, tried to work quickly to analyze, assess, come up with those new and creative ideas that would surprise. Certainly 5 years ago, if somebody said that the pharmaceutical industry would step up to the plate and strongly support healthcare reform being implemented, that probably would have been a surprise to a lot of people. And there's a lot of other examples like this. We won't go through the details because I'm seeing we're getting real close to the end of my 15 minutes. But really, it's that thought process that I like to think about as I'm going through and doing my work. And I suspect you may not have thought about what you do every day in this way. But when you consider the process, I hope that this makes some sense for all of us. And at the end of the day, if any of you are interested in learning more about Boyd, and I've got a whole long list of different things, no, I don't get any royalties off of this, but this book in particular, this biography of Boyd, I'll warn you, the language is a little bit on the salty side, but it really gives some interesting insights into this individual who I might add, not a perfect role model for a lot of people on a lot of different ways, but yet some of the thinking and the processes that he leads people through, I think, is very helpful in creative thinking. So I guess we move to questions now.
So yesterday I said, what's the big idea? And I didn't realize until I talked to Jim Pinkerton later in the morning that that's right. What is the big idea? If you've listened to these talks and some of the proposals they're going to make here in just a second when I draw it out of them, and start thinking about how, you're missing the point. This is not a how morning. This is a what morning. What Jim was saying was the best CEOs are the ones who really figure out what. And if you come in and only focus on the how, you lose your vision pretty quickly. So when we're listening to new ideas, it's really critical if you want them to survive 30 minutes that you not immediately focus on, well, how is that going to work? If you ask that question, you might as well go for a walk now. So don't get into the how. Let's just focus on the what for a minute, and for 30 minutes. So let's start with this concept of rationality, which is one of my favorite discussions. To begin with, what is rational assumes a lot. And as a drug company trying to become a healthcare company, we have a lot of assumptions that may or may not be rational. I assume by rational you mean in relation to some outside measurement system, whether it's logic or supply and demand theory, some external thing to a human being is what we usually mean when we say rational, because anybody who's got children or is married or even has a close friend knows that rational doesn't enter into it, right? So, and language, we know is an innate human trait, right? From Noam Chomsky and all the work done about how kids learn language, we know we are wired to have a language, and that semantics are sort of built into our way of operating. So I would argue, you talk about, do you want to make a bet if it's phrased this way versus that way? So we go out and we tell people, if you want to live right, you should do this. You should eat well, you should exercise, and everybody ignores it. If we say, if you don't want to die, do this. After someone tells you that unless you do this, you're going to die, people generally line up pretty fast. So is that a rational behavior or an irrational behavior that we keep phrasing things in the positive? To live a good life, take this, take Lipitor to lower your cholesterol because it might be bad for you to have high cholesterol. And by the way, you ought to be jogging or exercising and eating right. Are we appealing to the rational center of an irrational being and need to change the way we talk about it? I mean, is this a loop that we can't get out of, that if we are positive, we're going to lose? And it's only when people are told by their doctor it's this or else that they come to us and say, help? How do we get out of that loop?
That's a great question.
That's my job.
But I'm going to focus on the what instead of the how we get out of that loop. I think that rationality, as it's talked about, and I think it was important that in the grant they made this reference to an economic theory, that rationality can mean behavior in accordance with theory. My professor, Ray Battaglio, was one of the early, did some of the early work in experimental, and one of the things he did before you couldn't do it anymore, controlled economy type experiments, was test supply and demand theory in a women's psychiatric ward. So it was a ward for psychotic women. And he tested supply and demand, and it worked. And after that, he was always fond of saying that the only people that he knew were really rational were psychotic women, because he'd been able to test them. So rationality has to do with being specific to a theory, but it also has the connotation you meant, which is, can we reason through what you did, and can we find an explanation for it, even if we don't agree with it? And so some of this gets into preferences. I may think what your choice of car or the way you live your life is irrational. But that's because I have my own preference map that tells me what I ought to be doing, and you have yours. Certainly there are behavioral economists who study addictive behaviors, whether it's related to obesity or smoking or drug addiction, and they ask, how does this occur? One of the things they might do is try and elicit your risk preference and see if you're risk-loving. I mean, maybe you like risk. You don't mind. You don't count the future maybe that important. When the future becomes tomorrow, maybe you start to give it some weight. So maybe that's part of what we see. It could be also, though, something to do with the psychology. Kahneman called it accessibility, whether or not the information presented is accessible to people. But whether you like behavioral economics or you don't like it, or you buy into it or you don't buy into it, or how important you think it is, it's going to be part of the debate. And I think part of what we ought to be doing is looking forward. This CER grant, I think there were $7.5 million. When I did experiments, that's, I don't know, the $15 million in total, I think, was 10,000 times what I had to run experiments in graduate school. So I guess part of what I'm putting out is that we should think about things ahead of the time that they're due, and clearly this is going to be part of the conversation.
So would you say that our Lipitor ads now combine appealing to the positive, you should live your life better through diet and exercise, but because they start off with a guy who almost died from a heart attack, that it's appealing to the, if you don't do this, you're going to die, rational center of our brain. Do you think that that represents a sort of balance of the yin-yang here about today versus tomorrow, and that without necessarily thinking about it, that's what we ended up doing?
I think the sort of nugget that Kahneman's work comes out with is an aversion to loss. People don't like loss. If you phrase things in terms of people dying, 400 people dying for sure, it doesn't look as good as when you said 200 people will be saved. So if you present them with something that looks like a loss, they tend to stay away from it. So that may be a way to guide us in our ads. That's sort of something that somebody would have to go and test. I don't really know.
Yeah.
I don't know what the full presentation of the ad has to do, but certainly the loss aversion is something to think about.
So, Adam, first off, you're the only speaker I know who's so tall that when you point to the slide, you're actually on the slide. I mean, that was impressive. The other thing I love about the English is they can show you this huge viaduct and refer to it as a bit. I love that. A bit of architecture. That is great. So, stay rich, be optimistic, think big. This sounds like a Viagra ad to me. We obviously have to stay rich, and there are a lot of ways to do that, we hope. The optimistic part is what I'm going to talk about. Megan yesterday talked about the difference in culture between people who treat failure as the end of something and others who treat it as the beginning of something. And I know that in the note that you wrote to me about your talk, you referenced the fact that when things fail in the R&D pipeline, it causes a ripple through the whole company, and it can cause tension, obviously, between the business units and the R&D people if the business units look behind them and don't see anything coming. So what is your recommendation on how we as a culture need to figure out how to celebrate these failures, because they are all educational, they're all going to contribute to a future success, but if people either don't want to admit failure, so they camouflage it, or they don't think that they don't want to dwell on it by actually looking at what was learned. They just want to get away as fast as possible. What do you think we need to either change or preserve in our current culture to make failure the beginning of something, not the end of something?
Well, I mean, so I was thinking about the failure in R&D.
Move the mic closer to you.
So the failure in R&D and how people manage that. And I think something Megan said yesterday, which was that for anybody involved in a project, so particularly someone at a university working on a new mechanism or some epidemiology or something they think is going to work, it's unbelievably difficult to let go of that. Like, you're committed to it, you think you've got the best idea, that's part of your motivation to do the work, to get up and do really dull lab work normally, or look through screens and screens of data. So I think one of the important things, and one of the things which we need to preserve, because the pharmaceutical industry has been quite good at this, and certainly better than others, is our ability to say, let's stop this work. Right? Let's just stop this thing, because other people never let go. I mean, they will just keep on their thing for the rest of their academic career or whatever. So there is a discipline in the commercial elements of drug R&D, which I think is something we need to keep. And that need to fail early, and to learn from that, I think we can do more on. The thing I think we need to change in research, the way that we structure our research at the moment, is that when we fail in certain areas, we leave that area. So there's a lack of continuity often. So in some areas we've committed to certain bits of research, our invest to win areas, and those are great. But I work in Sandwich, which, the research hub, which doesn't have any invest to win areas. So they feel kind of a bit on the edge. Is their work really committed to by the company? So under those circumstances, if you fail and your failure leads to the closure of that site or that piece of work, that's too much to bear, and it's impossible to learn from those lessons when you fail, because if you fail with one molecule and that exits that whole therapeutic area, how do you learn anything from that? You don't. So it feels like one of the problems we have, and one of the things which is exciting about, I think, about the ViiV example, is that it creates a different kind of commitment to tangential therapeutic areas. So the people at ViiV, if they fail with some of the candidates that they're working on, they know what their purpose is, and it's to continue to work in HIV. They're not going to be told to go and work in Alzheimer's. They're going to do this. So it's a combination of that discipline about failing, but also managing a commitment to a longer-term process, which I think is kind of what we're struggling with within the organisation. And I don't wish... I mean, it's very easy to adopt one kind of side of the argument in this when you look at the way the company is structured. You know, I used to work in the commercial division, and it is really worrying. You see your revenues going, and you need this other stuff. You see this money that you're spending on research and development, and it's not producing stuff. So it's not that you should just keep going irrespective, but I think you need to understand what those failures are, understand that we are quite good at terminating projects when they're not going to work, and staying committed to those areas. And I think the other bit of that, if I can just keep talking for a bit more, is just about understanding the different timescales and what those different solutions are like. So in-licensing stuff helps you fill a gap in your productivity, but it shouldn't replace what is trying to produce that in the first place. So the research teams need to understand that in-licensing is not a threat to them. It's the way that we will continue work in certain areas. So, you know, it feels like we just need to sort of calm down a bit, stop thinking that everything's at stake with every decision that's being made. Be good at terminating projects and stay committed to therapeutic areas. I think that would be the recipe.
So, Chris, would you say that that the orientation phase determines what is rational?
I think the orientation phase is just at the end of the day, it's what's rational to those that are doing the analysis. But at the end of the day, I think it's critical to keep that constant feedback coming to us, because what may be rational today may not be rational tomorrow, because the environment is constantly evolving and changing. We're going to constantly get feedback not only on what other people are doing, but on the results of what we chose to do, how we acted, and we may need to modify the position. Is it rational? It may be rational in the reality for the time, but I think thinking about the OODA loop, you need to be open to the prospect that what was right for today, what is rational for today, is not necessarily rational for tomorrow.
So what would you say that what needs to be integrated in the Pfizer culture for us to be able to observe better and orient better?
Let's see. I guess there's a few things. One, sharing information is critical, because the more information that you can get to do your analysis, the better. But at the same time, the orientation part, as I said before, everybody has their own biases that they bring to the analysis. And I'm not suggesting bias in a bad way, but bias in a good way, because if you took everything at face value, you'd just have a jumbled mess. I think the challenge for a company like Pfizer is we have so many different people with so many different perspectives that joining those perspectives together and getting people to work together toward a common Schwerpunkt is the real challenge. But I think in order to be successful on a day-to-day basis in what we do, it's critical to give people, we often hear empowering employees. If you know what the mission is, there's a lot of different ways to get there. And any one of them may be right for a particular situation. I think, so to a certain degree, we need to, on one hand, give that focus, but on the other hand, allow for maneuverability to deal with whatever situation that we're faced with at a given point in time. And so that may result in different solutions. I guess as I think about some of the things that we've done over the past year, which is different than the way we had done it previously. And I think about our work in the States, where we would typically come up with a model bill and say, here's the legislation we want to pass, go introduce it. This past year, it was different in that we developed a series of one-page guides on here's basically what we would like to see happen on an issue of importance to us in a state. But we're not going to dictate to you exactly how that legislative language should look, giving degrees of freedom, the ability to maneuver. And we found that we were able to achieve in different states legislative language being introduced that was very different in terms of its structure in different states, yet it was all moving toward achieving an ultimate goal in different ways. And I think we were much more successful in that effort this past year as a result.
So I'm going to let people ask questions out here, but I want you to think about the last question I'm going to have, which is this. From each of your themes, about being optimistic, thinking big, about what's rational, what's not rational, about the OODA loop, it's a compound question. Where do we learn how to think? Is it possible to change how we think? And what do we mean when we refer to people in the company as old Pfizer? Okay? Questions out there? Yes, Tom?
Question for Adam. I was an expert witness with one of your competitors who should remain unnamed at this point. And I was confronted with a graph which showed predicted sales, I think it was phase 2 or phase 3, and actual sales. And there was virtually no predictability. So in light of that, what is the optimal strategy for rejecting projects in some sense? Because it seems to me a lot of times you get things that you have no idea it's going to take off, just take off, and you have new indications that you think of to add to the initial indication. And one could potentially think of a strategy where you let everything go and improve everything you can improve, because the downside is much lower than the potential upside. So in light of that evidence, the first question is Pfizer better than that company in predicting profits from future products at a particular stage? And if it's not, what sort of, how does that alter your R&D no-go decision?
That's a really easy question to answer. That's really difficult. That's unbelievable. That's the answer is, if we knew that, that would be difficult. But the whole game would be different. Are we better than other people? No. I mean, no evidence of that. I don't think. I guess maybe the way to look at estimated revenues from medicines is to use another military analogy, which is that when you make a plan, I can't remember, you'll know the terminology, but when you make a plan, it's always wrong when you confront it with the enemy. What's that story?
Not sure.
Anyway, but the process of planning helps you prepare for those things, right? So even if your plan isn't right, so that analysis about how many patients are there out there, what are the therapies, what's the likely kind of competitive price situation, even if that's not what happens, it helps you do two things. One, it helps you to understand at all you can probably rule out some areas which are just irrelevant. You're just not going to do that, and that helps prioritize. I think once you've been through that process, and this is certainly true within a company, that analysis is what people want to see to liberate money for you to do that work. Right? So you can't just say, oh no, we'll just get on with it. Don't ask us where we're spending the money or what we're prioritizing. You need to tell a story. It's like running a company. You need to tell a story to your investors. You need to articulate what you're trying to do and support that with some rationality. I think you're absolutely right, and this is maybe a bit an analogy to what Gary was saying yesterday, is that you can over-financialize everything and presume that you can mathematically work out what the optimal strategy is, and you can't. But the question, the other bit is to look back at those predictions and say, really, is there no predictability, or are the predictions just bad? So if you famously for Lipitor, I think our estimated earnings for that were $400 million a year when we bought it, or something like that. Obviously, it gave us revenues of $12 billion. But, so that's a big difference, right? But in both cases, it's a big selling drug, right? So the error bars are large, but it's not an orphan drug. It's not a tiny thing. So you have that, I suppose. The other final thing to say about that is some of the elements around personalized medicine might make that easier. So you might be able to... So one of the big variables is how many people will be treated with your drug for how long. And there might be some reasons to be more confident about some of those predictions in those areas. Although the pricing is such a challenge, it's very difficult to know. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's a balance between doing some work to show that you've put some effort in, and then understanding roughly what the kind of envelope of outcome and revenue might be.
Investors might agree. I'll give you an analogy. So at University of Chicago, our students all look alike. They're maxed out on their GREs. They have great grades. They have recommendations from best places, blah, blah, blah. There's no predictability in the admission files whether these are going to be superstars in academics, which is your blockbusters. So the strategy is take in everyone, or as big as we can, i.e., don't terminate any R&D project, and then hope that we get as many draws of this uncertain superstar as possible. And that could be, why can't one justify that to investors? Why can't one say, we don't know how to predict this stuff, and therefore we should try to get as many draws as possible, and that will maximize profits. I don't see an inconsistency with taking in a large pool with having higher profits.
Well, next question. Don't answer that. We'll talk about that at the break. Is there another question? That was a good point. Yes, Tamara?
Hi. Also a question for Adam. This is sort of continuing a discussion we were having in the bus, and it's a comment related to the Morgan Stanley point of view. And there are two parts. It's brief. I'm not making an essay here. The first is the chart that you put up about the success rates. And I think that's informative, but it's not fully informative unless you know the cost you paid for the in-licensed product. So if each one of those projects in the in-licensed line cost 1/10 as much as the ones inside, then even a lower success rate would be valuable and better. But actually, the main point I wanted to make was your follow-up comment about recognizing failure early, and how hard it is for people who spend a lot of their time developing something to admit failure about that particular project. And to me, in fact, that sort of argues for outsourcing, because in this case, you let people outside the company, adopt their projects, fight for them. And what you have is sort of an objective observer that happens to be us that kind of picks and chooses between these projects. And we don't have any built-in R&D organization that's going to fight decisions about whether to terminate a project early or not when it's pretty obvious that a project ought to be terminated early. So it seems to me that the idea of trying to improve productivity in R&D by recognizing failure early in some ways argues for sort of separating the R from the D and letting the D guys decide which R projects fail without having a lot of pushback, which is what you would get if the R guys are still in the same company. And quick comment to Tom. I guess your students don't cost $1 billion a piece, so that's why we get.
It's getting there. It's getting there.
Well, I mean, there's a classic argument to your first point, which is that if you don't have any in-house capacity, you can't. You may be objective, but you're also rather ignorant. So you're picking those things from people who are desperate to sell them to you, and you have no capacity to evaluate them. So in all the arguments about open innovation systems and all that kind of stuff, that's one of the... You need to retain some kind of in-house capacity, people familiar with that work. So again, as we were saying yesterday, what the limits are, how much you in-license and how much you do yourself will vary, and I think it will vary by therapeutic area. And again, I mean, the other thing that we're facing, I think, not just our company, but other companies have adopted this structure of separating the D from the R bit, is that you kind of create a sort of internal market for those things. I think what we won't know yet is whether our ability to sell to our own organisation from research into the business units is better than other sources of that. I mean, that's a deliberate strategy to kind of open that up. So it's trying to separate those two in a productive way, but you hope that you retain enough capacity to evaluate what those different options are, however imperfect that would be.
Okay. So, do we have one more question here? Anna Maria? Microphone.
I was just going to make a quick follow-up point, which is that, what leads to quality decisions is quality data. And just because organizations are on the outside doesn't mean that their data is a higher quality standard than ours. And that's a real focus for our R&D organization right now, is driving towards quality decisions with higher quality data.
Okay. So let me go to that question I gave you a minute ago, but keep it short. What do we mean when we say somebody's old Pfizer? Is that a way of thinking? And what is the implication for what we need to be doing at Pfizer if we want new thinking? Start with Joe.
Wow. I thought I was going to be excused because I just got here. So
I'm starting with you because you're new Pfizer.
So I may find it difficult to recognize old Pfizer. I think, though, I'm going to answer the question you asked before the break, which was, how do people think, and how does it modify? I mean, there's a debate, the OODA rule and scientific method both sort of rely on experience and reason. You have observations and theories, and they're built and they go around on each other. But I think we change our thinking based on our success. If what we're doing is working, then we probably keep doing it. That's what we'll find. If it's not working, bad experiences cause you to change what you've been doing and move on to other things. You can adopt from other areas, adopt, and I forgot the last one.
Okay. Adam?
I just go back to research. I think there are some old Pfizer traditions from research. I was thinking about John Lamartina, who's a good guy, but embodied an older way of looking at Pfizer, former R&D head, who was adamant, never give away a structure, never, ever give away a structure, as I recall. I overlap with him a bit. Don't kind of share any of that information about structures at all. And I think what we're seeing now is across companies is about some people who think all research is competitive. Every single thing that we do, we're in a competition with other people. And the new way of looking at that, which some people are advocating, is that loads of information, particularly around biology, is just not competitive. Our knowledge about a particular target that we want to work on is not a competitive advantage to us. We should share all of that information. All companies should contribute to our knowledge of targets, and we should compete where we absolutely have to compete, which is the quality of our chemistry, the quality of the other therapeutics we might use, the speed and pace, and the quality of the data that we produce to support our products. So the question is, where's that boundary between what's pre-competitive and what's competitive? And that's what I think is shifting between old and new.
Okay. Chris?
Well, as an old guy, 50, seriously, when I hear old Pfizer, I guess as I think about this and the way Boyd might suggest old Pfizer, it would probably be people that are attached to doctrine, like, this is the way we've done it, this is the way we've been successful. We need to hold on to it to a point that doctrine is no longer doctrine. It becomes dogma. It becomes holy. You can't change it. And I think the difference between old and new is, old Pfizer held on to those cultural traditions and wouldn't let go of it. And new Pfizer, I guess I think of as someone who's not only, looking to be flexible and open to changes, but to learn as many other doctrines of other companies, of other stakeholders as possible, because at any given point in time, any one of those could be valuable input and a valuable observation for us. And it's that ability to change and reinvent ourselves that probably is how I would distinguish old Pfizer, at least the way I hear it used, versus the Pfizer of today.
Good. That's a good answer. Join me in thanking our group here. Excellent job. So we're going to take 15 minutes. We'll take 15 minutes. We'll be back here at 9:33.